Hey, everybody, and welcome. This is Jack. Welcome, welcome, welcome. If you're joining, it's the end of the week, and I thought I'd go live. If you're here in real time, thank you for being here. If you're here after the event, thank you for tuning in. I've called this live stream What's Going On in the World, because this seems to be a topic of much concern to many of you. I get people reaching out to me about this, and I just thought I'd share a few perspectives that have been helpful for me, in case they've been helpful for you. If you're here, feel free to drop a message. Tell me where you're tuning in from. Tell me if you've got any questions. I may do some Q&A at the end here if we have time. And also, if you're leaving a message after the event, I will pick those up as well. So feel free to fire away. So what's going on in the world? It's lively at the moment, right? A lot of the commentary that I hear, particularly through the media, but even on new media as well, is talking about the decay and decline of democracy, which may or may not be the perspective that you're in. But if you're in that perspective, it can feel difficult to imagine that we might be getting at some point to any kind of better place. Like everything really is about decline, despair, climate emergency, the frailty of democracy, democratic backsliding, partisanship, government gridlock, signs of low-grade inflammation, even civil war, political assassinations becoming more normalized. We've got some difficult stuff that we need to reckon with as a society. Clearly, I don't have all the answers to that. I'm happy to be in conversation with you to see if there's ways that we can find some better answers and ways of proceeding. One of the things that I have been involved in over the last several years is a group called Braver Angels, but there are many groups like this that try to get people together to talk across political divides, and not to change anyone's mind, but principally just to humanize one another and to get curious and to listen and to understand where people might be coming from. So that is one encouragement that I would give you if you're not involved in a group like that, is to see if there's some kind of chapter or alliance in your area, or maybe start one if it doesn't exist, where you can get together with people and you don't have to agree on things, but you can find that perhaps you care about similar things in your community. Perhaps you can find that for all your differences, there are places that you have common ground. This is in some ways the work of democracy. It's also the work of you as an individual and your personal growth. I think from all my experience, well over a decade of personal coaching, but really being in human development for coming up 25 years. Gosh, yeah, that's why these this hair's thinning. One of the best ways to grow is to lean into difference in relating. And I'm not saying it's easy. I've been handed difficult experiences and experiences I haven't been able to make sense of in this terrain. But I found the more that I lean into it, the more that I get to be myself, the more I allow other people to be themselves, the more I own what's true from my lived experience, the more I can invite other people to own what's true in their lived experience. And we have this kind of mantra in certain aspects of personal growth that says your lived experience is unarguable or inarguable. And it basically means you're the authority on your lived experience. You know what's going on inside you. You know what you think about something. You know what you feel about something, or at least to the extent that you can be consciously aware of those things. And I'm not the authority on those things, right? And one of the ways that we can talk to each other better is if I allow you to be the authority on your lived experience. And if you allow me to be the authority on my lived experience, then we don't have to argue about those things, because in a sense they're inarguable, and I know, but we can get to relate across them, and we can get to be curious, and we can maybe get to notice, wow, the way that you encode life and the way that I encode life are very different. Or the reason that you do a particular thing and the reason that I do a particular thing are really different. And you might have heard, if you've been on this channel before or from other places, the fancy phrase, subjectification. And that really means when I subjectify you, I make the assumption that you're more like me than you actually are. and that when you think a certain thing, I will know why you think a certain thing. And when you feel a certain thing, I'd know why you feel a certain thing, right? So if I'm hosting a party and you turn up late, I know that that means something. That means you didn't want to come. It means you don't think the party's important. It means you're disrespecting me. Fill in the blank. Because maybe if I were late to your party, that might be true for what it would mean for me, but I don't know that it's true for you. So we get into this territory of making fewer assumptions about each other. And that, I mean, whether it's professional relationships at work, whether it's intimate relationships, family relationships, or relationships with people where you're talking politics, I think that principle holds across all of them. That the fewer assumptions you make about me and the more curiosity you have in my direction, and the more that I can do that for you, generally, the better the conversation's going to go. And it's where I make quick assumptions that, oh, if you have a particular view, it must be that you're a bad person, right? Or that you don't care. This is one that I see commonly in political conversations, right? If someone supports X policy, then they don't care about all elderly people, children, women, pick a group that might be impacted by this policy. Now, it might be that you care more about this thing than they do, right? Or it might be the way that you're encoding care, what care means for you, is showing up more in this particular policy, but the way that they care, or the people that they most want to care in their politics, just looks different. So all of the stuff that we're practicing in our personal growth and our personal relationships, I think we actually need en masse in our political discourse and in our civic conversations about, hey, how are we going to get ourselves into a better place? And if democracy at one level means a mass conversation, how do we have better mass conversations? And how do we have conversations where I get myself out of the way so that I can be more available to you? It doesn't mean I need to diminish my lived experience. Maybe I'm in pain and I'm suffering and I need to let you know that, right? Or maybe something's happened that I'm really upset about, and that's allowed. But if I can be upset, but also create space for you and your pain and suffering and upset, generally, I'm not just doing that for you. Generally, there's something in it for me, because I think most of us prefer it when we think better things about people, right? If the best option on my menu is to really dislike and hate you, that's generally not good for me, right? So there's a sort of self-care, self-centeredness piece in this as well. Generally, we prefer ourselves, I think, when we keep ourselves more open, when our hearts are open, and when we can be curious. We're going to like how we show up more, and generally other people prefer it as well. So there's kind of a win-win in here. Welcome if you're just joining us. Talking about this, where the world is at. This is kind of a big topic in some ways, but when I've done surveys to people saying, what is it that you're worried about? This thing comes up, like the state of the world, just this sort of generalized sense of anxiety about where we are and where we're going, that traditional sort of ways that we've navigated reality are breaking down. And I do happen to think we're in a cycle of breakdown. I think the question is whether that breakdown might also lead to breakthroughs. And that can sound like convenient language, but often some things have to be let go of or die or change in order that something better can come through. And when I look at the world through that lens, I tend to feel more curious and hopeful about what might be coming, so there's been a lot of talk about we've got to protect democracy, and I totally understand that perspective, and I'm in that perspective a lot, right? There's lots of things that previous generations have worked hard for, fought hard for, and forged that we might want to keep, and we might want to be very careful before letting them go. And I think there's also this perspective that we talk a lot about democracy, but what we really mean when we say that is giving our power to representatives to make decisions on our behalf. And I don't know if that's going to be fit for purpose in the fullness of the 21st century. And so one of the things that might be breaking down is even our idea about what democracy is, and creating more of a space where we could think about, what actually could democracy be if my participation were much more required? In most domains of our life, we don't fully outsource things, right? Sort of, particularly when it comes to personal growth, I think that's very hard to outsource. You can be in your professional life, in your business, you can outsource things, you can have an assistant, you can have AI helping you. When it comes to your growth and your own inner experience and getting close to how you have dealt with difficult things, your need for healing, relaxing your inner critic and self-doubt. It's really hard to outsource these things. And I'm increasingly sort of getting into the view, or at least trying on the view, that maybe we can't outsource our politics quite as much as we have up until now. The sort of notion that I'm too busy to get engaged, to understand some of the issues of the day. Meanwhile, we all have views on these things and we throw them around pretty liberally online. That maybe we need to be a bit more involved in getting educated on some of these issues, and perhaps we can design for a system that requires that kind of education, right? So I've talked to you before maybe about citizen assemblies, or some kind of way that your learning is built into the process. In a citizens assembly, people come together, they learn about the issue for a number of days before they deliberate it, and then before they come to some kind of recommendations. A much deeper learning cycle actually than most representatives would have on any particular issue, because tasking 300 to 500 people to decide all the policy pretty much at the national level, at least all the legislation, it's actually a lot. And so it's generally a pretty shallow cut that people are getting on any of those particular policies. I spent a lot of my life, maybe much of the last decade, really focused on my own sort of personal integration. All right, how can I become more fully myself? What are the edges of my authenticity? Where do I notice that I'm in some kind of persona or way of being that is outdated or limited, or an adaptive strategy from childhood that I don't have to be in anymore? How can I more fully speak my truth? How can I be more curious about other people's truths? How can I find ways of relating with people that have less friction and more authenticity? And that work, I believe, is really important. And I've seen sometimes in a way where I feel a little, what's the right word? Jealous is not quite the right word, but things that I felt like I had to really fight hard for, and really, travel the world and go find teachers and find, seminars and retreats and books in curious places, and sort of really follow the seeker's thread of how do you learn about this stuff? Now when I go on, Instagram or TikTok, I see tons of this content available. Now, obviously, it's not the only content available. There's all sorts of content available there. But I think what it means is generationally, some things are more accessible than they were to, my generation and generations that are older than me. The desire to have good mental health, perspectives on self-care. I mean, I had to be best part of 30 years old before I heard someone talk about self-care. I remember when I first came to Boulder and people were talking about healing. It didn't really make sense to me. I mean, healing for me was something, more of a physical thing, right? Like you've had an injury and you're going to heal, right? Or you've cut your finger and you're waiting for it to heal. But the notion of sort of emotional and psychological and spiritual healing being so valued in a culture and so kind of front and center in the way people talked was completely surprising to me. And through time, I became much more intrigued about it. And maybe even part of the reason that life brought me to Boulder was to have some of my own healing. And I'm sort of basically concluding that the more people have done that, the more it creates other possibilities for us to be together collectively. That the more individuated you are, the more your authentic self is online. Now we need to think about, well, that sort of authentic journey is a little bit of a me process, right? How when we've had enough of that me time, or time of looking deeply at self, how do we come together in our individuation, in our authenticity, to start to create more authentic structures, right? Including an authentic politics. Well, what would it be like if the people that had the loudest megaphones in politics, or the people in the room in a citizens assembly, were really being invited to be authentic, to talk about the lived experience, to not have to pretend, to not have to act, to not have to really work hard to get someone's vote, to sort of say the right thing to get someone's vote, to then do a different thing when they're in power. What if when you heard the State of the Union address, it didn't sound like political theater, but sounded like political authenticity? I think these are some of the questions of our time, because increasingly, one of the reasons you can say that populism is attractive is economic, right? And we can look at the data on, even since COVID, how the 1% have fared much better. and the proportion of national wealth that's in the 1%, or the fact that in the UK, 50 families own more than the bottom 50%, or in the US, you can pick, 3 individuals that have a net worth of, many tens of millions of people combined. And we should look at that, and we should talk about what economics we want in the 21st century, and are there ways that we can distribute asset ownership that are more fair, but also create better social trust and social conditions, because there's good evidence to suggest that the less equality you have, the less social trust you have, because people are just having very different experiences of life. If you're really, really struggling, it's hard to trust someone who's got a completely different experience and is, heading off for multiple vacations and has, opportunities and access and yachts and the rest of it that you don't have. But there's another type of reason that we might look to populism, which would be to say something like the politics that we have isn't particularly authentic, and people are yearning for that. And one of the reasons that someone like Donald Trump or someone like Nigel Farage in the UK have been popular, even if this isn't your experience of them, is that some people find an authenticity in them because they're not like typical politicians, and they're more willing to speak their mind, and they're more willing to say things that are controversial. And again, you might have your view as to why they're saying those things, or even the damaging effects of saying those things. So I'm not challenging any of that in this moment. I'm just saying a lot of people cite authenticity as their reason for liking these people. And it might have us curious about how we create a culture in our politics, because sometimes you might have heard this expression that we get the leaders that we deserve. And there's times I've thought, well, that's incredibly harsh, right? If you're living under some, pick your worst thing, genocidal, authoritarian, fascistic regime, is that really the people's fault, right? But it's sort of just a perspective that says there's a sort of a reciprocal relationship at some level between leaders and people, right? And often leaders also follow the people, right? Where there's enough of a trend or enough of an energy in a particular direction. Some people say that's actually politicians doing their job when they're responding to the people. The challenge is if the people are supporting things that you don't like, then it obviously creates a whole lot of issues. But how would we have a system that starts to foster more authenticity? It's hard for you to be authentic in your politics when what's offered to you is a menu that has an A and B choice, or normally there's only an A and B choice that are competitive in a particular district. And an A is a party that maybe you never vote for, and B is perhaps a party that you do or sometimes vote for. I sometimes say that if this was restaurants, it's like having 2 restaurants, one of which is a restaurant that serves meat and you're a vegetarian, and the other is a restaurant that serves kimchi and you don't like spicy food. So you don't really have your authentic choice. Now, one way we can deal with this is by having things like ranked choice voting, where you can rank all of the candidates, so we can get a bit more of a nuanced view of what your preferences are. But one of the other ways we can get more authenticity in politics is to have you in the room, and that's what happens in a citizens' assembly. Or we can actually allow you to vote directly on some things. Your direct preferences are expressed. And maybe there's many other ways that we can do this. I'm just trying to help sort of stimulate the conversation to say, if you care about being authentic, and we talk a lot more about authenticity in society, how do we actually create structures and consciousness in politics that can reflect that? Where it's not about having an opinion or projection on a political leader, but where you actually have to wrestle with some of the issues and the detail of the issues to come to a view that feels true to you. And sometimes we make this distinction between, raw and filtered public opinion. And filtered public opinion means you've had to actually engage with the issues in some kind of deliberative process. So you've had to sit down, you've had to learn, you've had to hear from people, you've had to talk to people about it. How can we create some more of those spaces so that becomes more of the norm in politics? A couple of years ago, I ran an event. It's just small, there's 6 of us, and it's basically inviting people to share, how did you come to your politics? How did you come to think about politics in the way that you do, or to value the things that you do value? And people were sharing stories. One person shared a story of how inspired they were as a boy and young man with the rise of Barack Obama, and the fact that someone that looked like them could end up having this kind of impact in politics. It was just really touching to hear this sort of heartfelt inspiration that had activated them, sort of politically activated them. Other people just said it's not common to have somewhere where people actually care and have the quality of listening to hear, well, this happened and this happened, and I started to think this, and then I started to think that. We don't create those kind of spaces, right? We debate each other as if that's going to create more truth, when normally it's all the things that go. I remember this when I was at the student union at Cambridge, right? You'd get people debating, and so much of it is sophistry, really. It's debate tactics, it's one-upmanship, it's superiority complexes, it's gotcha, it's whataboutism, but it's not really about the pursuit of the truth. In my experience, again, a lot of this is as a coach, if you're trying to help people get closer to the truth of what is happening for them so that they can actually presence their own experience, generally you slow it down and you get curious and you stop and pause and you notice what's happening for you right now. What's coming up for you? What do you feel about that? None of that's available when you and I are debating, right? We're doing something else. We're normally convicted of our own righteousness, and I'm trying to persuade you and you're trying to persuade me. Now, I can love a good debate just like the next person. I'm not saying that we need to do away with that. I am saying that we might benefit from creating spaces where the dominant technology isn't debate, but is actually something different. It's something like listening. It's something like getting the other person's worldview. It's something like dialogue, where we have a back and forth of exchange that is inclusive of each other's perspectives and builds on them, and invites from the other person a calmer nervous system that probably opens them up to more of what's true for them, right? Whereas when we're debating fast and it's a who's going to win and it's kind of a survival, nothing new is likely to come online for each person. You might have something new come through you, a new way of saying something, but it's maybe less likely that you're really shifting something in the other person. So we might need to create spaces that aren't about winning, that aren't about partisanship, that are actually about finding one another, including more perspectives, hearing more lived experience. It's another way of talking about equity, really, is how do we get everyone's lived experience into the room and center perspectives that are normally overlooked? And how do we care most about people who are actually close to the issues? All right, this is this idea that, those with the power should be closest to the pain. Right? If this is something that really impacts your life because it's happening day in, day out, right? We're talking about some kind of chronic condition and you have that condition. If I'm talking about it and I don't have it, and for me, it's almost more of a philosophical or theoretical thing. And maybe I even have an informed view about it, but it's not the same thing as you're living with the actual consequences of this thing. And so the policies that affect you could be life or death, could be huge quality of life issues. And yet, how do we get your experience into the room? And in an ideal world of representative democracy, your experience would be metabolized through your representative. But whether you actually have a relationship with your representative, most people don't. Most people don't know who the representative is. They've never met them. They haven't gone to a town hall or constituency meeting. And the pushback is, well, you should go, but maybe you're living with a chronic condition and actually getting outside the house is enough, before even tasking you with going to talk to your representative. But also just the notion that a representative is going to take 700,000 people and sort of represent them. That's almost an impossible job. And you might say, well, yeah, that's the reality. We live in mass societies. We live with millions of people. So how do you filter all those things through? I sort of have a vision of more of those conversations happening more of the time, where more people's perspectives, right, rather than an incredibly centralized system with 300 or 500 representatives, where there's just not the time, the space, or the curiosity to have most people's experiences included. Feel free to say hello if you're just joining us. Thank you. This is a little bit of a conversation about the state of the world, big topic, but sort of where we're going, how you feel about things. One of the skills that we might need more of in our time is sense making. Like, how do you actually make sense of the world? How do you make sense of the world when maybe the normal or traditional or tried ways of making sense of it aren't actually so applicable, or they're not helping you make sense of it? This is a sort of a new moment, and it's a powerful and disorienting thing at once. I mean, even if we think about what's happened with media, when I grew up, we were excited, and it was a little bit of a disappointment in the end, but we were excited that we had 5 TV channels. We had 4 of them: BBC One, BBC Two, ITV, Channel 4, and then they launched this 5th channel, Channel 5, which we ended up not watching. And I think the general view was it was the lesser channel. Is that fair to say? Correct me if I'm wrong, but to the other four. But it maybe meant that a lot of times people were tuning into the same show, right? So they were tuning into the same talk show, they were tuning into the same news, or maybe someone was tuning into ITV News and someone BBC, but there's maybe one or a few options, and maybe you take the Times and I take the Guardian, but there's sort of one of a few options of main newspapers. And maybe you listen to a different local radio station, but sort of nationally there's not that many radio stations competing. So most people are broadly getting their news from a sort of definable number of sources, right? Now you compare that obviously with what's happening now, and the world has exploded, right? Now the upside we have of that, which you might know, is that we have a diversity of perspectives that people are hearing at some level. If it depends where they're tuning in, but we also have these filter bubbles and silo effects and algorithmic black holes, so that people actually hear less in some ways than they did. Depends how you look at it. But it's probably the job of postmodernism to deconstruct and break down these kind of traditional and also kind of power hoarding ways of communicating information, right? That sort of back in the day, the BBC in the UK was kind of the authority on what's happening, right? And some people still treat the BBC that way, and I think it still has a lot of credibility. But there's generations that aren't getting their news from these traditional sources. They're getting their news from TikTok and from people who are mixing that news in with their own lived experience and perspective. So we've just got multiple perspectives. Now, this is a facet of higher level leadership. How do you be in and take multiple perspectives? So there's a personal growth thing that's happening here. If you can be with different types of information and different types of perspectives, that's a good thing generally. What it doesn't give us is a sort of a shared reality easily between us, right? Because if I'm down this TikTok black hole, so to speak, and you're down this rabbit hole on Instagram and someone else is tuning into traditional media, we're going to be hearing and being with very different realities or ways of talking about even the same event. Now, of course, in some ways, this reveals what was always happening, right? Which is you're having a subjective experience and I'm having a subjective experience. But maybe those subjective experiences weren't really getting included in the group decision making, right? Because it was sort of like the traditional folks with traditional backgrounds or elite backgrounds who are finding themselves into the corridors of power, sort of their worldviews are going to be most upheld in the system. But now, in some ways, we've got a decentralization of that. It's not complete because there's also a lot of centralization that happens on social media, meaning some influencers have huge followings and most people have relatively little. It's almost a bit like being a pop artist, right? There's a few people that make an incredible living, and most people, if they're trying to follow their art, make a little, or they're kind of struggling. But that diversity of perspectives could be a strength, but now we're struggling to find the unity within the diversity because we don't have that many things that we agree on. And maybe some of these things we never agreed on, but we didn't even have to talk about it. We didn't even realize. But now we can be in completely different information architectures where we don't even have to try to kind of bridge those divides. So, it's going to take plenty smarter people than me to figure out how we kind of find an information architecture that doesn't ultimately tear at the fabric of democracy. But the way that I'm holding that currently is actually we're going to have to reimagine democracy for the information age that we're in, right? Which is social media and AI. And one of the things that might mean is that you have to be in the room a little bit more often. If you were invited even once a year, let's say, to be part of a citizen jury that's looking at a particular issue, we're going to need several days of your time. Maybe ultimately you get compensated or a stipend, or there's some kind of tax rebate, or maybe actually you don't need that because you're semi-retired and actually you have the time and you're willing to donate it. However that gets organized, in the same way that juries, people do get some compensation typically for being on a jury, but it's not necessarily the same as a living wage or the same as their daily wage. But the jury is this sort of democratic structure, right? Trial by jury of your peers that's been there all, well, I was going to say all along. That's not true, but I think it was there pretty foundationally in the American Constitution, because there's a constitutional right to a trial by jury, I think. And in the UK system, I think that grew out of an earlier structure that we wouldn't have had it, but maybe that's been in place for hundreds of years also. And we're talking about taking something of that technology and maybe using it to make more decisions. So the who is in the room becomes more of a democratic lottery, that everyone has the equal possibility of being in the room, um, rather than it being the same voices and ultimately, career politicians, which we've had both sides of the Atlantic. Seems particularly an issue in the US and particularly an issue for the Democratic Party. Um, RBG, Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, died in office. Joe Biden was obviously going to have his second term before people pushed back hard against that. There have been a number of Democratic lawmakers who've died in office in their 80s and 90s. And this is a different way of thinking about people power and citizen power. That means you're not just looking at representatives, that actually you're inviting ordinary people with their lived experience to get more educated on the issues and to actually render judgment, the minimum that they can agree to, on behalf of their peers. So it's not just you going into the room and saying, this is what I think, although you're allowed to express what you think. It's actually you learning about the issues and then saying, oh, as someone who's a demographic representative of my community, because we create these demographics representative subgroups. So if the population is 50% men, we're going to have 50% men in the room. If the population is 50% above 45, we're going to have 50% of people above 45, and so on. So you're there on behalf of your community to make some kind of public decision, and it might not be one that you fully like, but it might be one that you can minimally agree to. So it's a slightly different way of looking at it. At the moment, for most of the time in our politics, we're encouraged to have opinions, kind of throw them around, and there's not much consequence of me having an opinion. I can sort of think what I want about immigration or water quality or pick your issue, because there's not a real consequence other than maybe I win or lose an argument, or someone likes me more or less in my friendship group. But this is saying, actually, no, we need your intelligence, we need more of us involved in this process, because actually, if we structure it right, we can bring more intelligence, plug more of us into the neural network, so to speak, and then we can make better decisions because there's more intelligence. The ant colony is bigger. At the moment, if all that is going through 300 or 500 people, that's quite a limitation on the system. It's quite a lot to ask of those people. And if they have blind spots, those blind spots are going to be replicated across decisions year after year after year after year after year. Whereas when you stand up a citizens jury, it comes together, it does its thing over normally 5 to 9 days, spaced out across months, and then actually goes away. So it's sort of the opposite of having a permanent political class. And it's something I think we're going to see a lot more of. Let me know if you're here, where you're tuning in from. Let me know if you've got any questions. I'm curious if this is making sense. I realize I'm riffing a little bit, but it's a Friday night, and I wanted to come on and say hi, happy Halloween. Curious what people are up to. Supposed to be going to a party here shortly, but I'm not that great with the costumes. I'm just going to own that. But also wasn't being very helped today. I did go to a couple of stores, and they had decided to pull their Halloween stuff yesterday. So maybe I don't understand something about that, but that didn't quite make sense to me. I thought, could you not have just waited another day or two? Maybe they make so much money on putting Christmas stuff in that they just can't wait another day. I'm sure there's some kind of commercial reason why they do that. This was Target, one of them. So I'm sure they thought this through. Anyways, I'm curious if there are any places or spaces in your life that you go to have quality conversations. Like maybe you have it in your family, maybe you have it in therapy or something, but I'm curious if there's any group contexts where you feel like, yeah, you know what, we do a pretty good job of being with each other, of allowing difference, of connecting across it. Because that's one of my contentions here, even outside of whether we change the structure of democracy, is just that we need civic activation. We need more conversation spaces that have better qualities of listening. And one of the ramifications of this is actually a curriculum one, is if we want a people-powered democracy in the 21st century that has a quality of dialogue and listening and making contact, of owning your lived experience and being open to someone else's lived experience, of speaking inarguably about what is your lived experience and not just your theory or your projection or your thought on someone else, then maybe we need to prepare young people with these skills. Certainly at college age, but I'm thinking much younger. I actually had a heartening conversation this week with a group that runs student councils in schools, including elementary, primary school, super young, 6-year-olds. And their basic premise is that if you want equity, and one way of thinking about that is everyone's voice matters, then you have to design for that. So rather than the usual student council, which tends to kind of be offered to the most confident kids in the group, who then get to have their voice and get more confident and develop great skills and maybe doing a great job at it, but actually leaves most people behind and out. Um, and I was talking to the founder of this group, and he was saying this was one of his observations from going to uh, colleges or elite universities, and sort of noticing that depending on the background of the kids, and there's kind of a class aspect to this, that people more or less feel confident to speak up and out in certain spaces. So why not try to cultivate those skills in young people? So the idea is there's a kind of a rotated leadership, that everyone gets the chance to host the group, and they have this technology that makes it very easy for the kids to have a group conversation. What do we think about this? Should this happen in our school? Do we prefer X over Y? To break out in small groups, have votes, and then kind of aggregate them so the class can make some kind of deliberative decision. That's pretty awesome. And in some ways, it's this sort of essential thinking, right? Getting right to the essence of, if we care about equity and equality, and I realize there's a big pushback against equity at the moment. I do happen to believe in the fullness of time, that will be here to stay. It might just be that it needs to be balanced with other ways of thinking. So it's not equity above everything else. It's kind of equity alongside other things, maybe where that's going to go. But to think about how do you really embed that systemically from a super young age, if that's something that we want to prepare people to be, active citizens in a way that is equitable, then it's not easy to do that if every structure up until that point hasn't been prioritizing some kind of equity. Now, I know this gets into conversations, people who are used to the traditional way of doing things, where we score everything. We have leagues, it's competitive, and there's winners and there's losers, and a worldview that says in life there are winners and losers, right? This is a different worldview, I think, than the equity worldview that says everyone has something to offer. Everyone's lived experience matters. Everyone's voice can matter. And that's not to say that everyone is equal on every sort of way of thinking about talent and value, right? Clearly, some people are going to be better at math, or better at languages, or better at pick your sport. But that's not the only thing that we're paying attention to. And we're much more interested in, where does this person shine? And how do we create some of the skills that are needed in the 21st century economy, that's not just about having one winner and most people losing, that are actually about collaboration and group creativity, and finding the emergence that comes out of a group, and self-organizing, which are different principles than a sort of a winner takes all, right? In some ways, the way that we do sports day, right, where there's most veneration traditionally for people that come first, or first, second, and third, is kind of the same consciousness as a winner takes all constituency, where someone can get elected, but they've only actually got 28% of the vote. So 72% of the people said no to them. And yet this is the person that gets into office. Is actually one of the reasons that the Labour Party is struggling in the UK at the moment, because they won a kind of landslide victory in terms of the numbers of seats that they got in Parliament. But if you look at the actual vote across the country, and then you combine it with the turnout, the high proportion of people that didn't vote at all, I think they only got something like 30% of the vote. So most people weren't that into them. And then you kind of wonder why the government's not particularly popular. Well, it's like they were never that popular to start with, is part of the equation there. So I was, just excited to see that there are some of these ideas are kind of reaching down into schools. There's a group that brings middle school and high school kids to DC to have immersion democracy programs, politics programs, get to meet with lawmakers, go to Capitol Hill, meet their Congress people. In some instances, even they've had audiences with the president, which is kind of incredible. I'm not sure if that still happens. But using Washington, D.C. as the classroom for history, the monuments, touring people around, and just getting people exposed. And, it got me to reflect on some of the immersion learning experiences I had as a young adult, and even before that, were just really powerful for me. And I know from my own experience of going to Cambridge that it takes something to feel comfortable in those sorts of environments, and not everyone feels equally comfortable based upon their history and past experience. So the notion of getting young people to DC to meet with people that make the law, to me, that's great. And it's how do we open up more of those spaces? When I went and got to observe their citizens assembly 2 months ago, sorry, oh no, we're still October, 1 month ago. You got a lot of people who were voicing, who had not been part of any sort of political event where anyone had asked them what they thought or what their lived experience was. We need more spaces like that, right? Otherwise, town halls tend to be dominated by the same voices, and it tends to be people who are used to having access and used to having their opinions heard. And it's good that they have their opinions heard, but wouldn't it be great if we had that for everyone? And sometimes that's it's a familiarity thing, right? So just going into council chambers, right? I remember going for the first time to Alexandria's council chambers here, and it's a little bit intimidating. You don't quite know what the protocol is, how it works, who talks when, why someone's now talking. All of that stuff is there's a kind of there's a way of doing things. To me, it's almost how I felt. The extreme example of this, I don't know if you watched either the Queen's funeral or King Charles's coronation, but there's so much stuff that's happening that I haven't got a clue what is actually happening right now. Why is that person passing that object to that person? And okay, the BBC are going to try to give you their best voiceover commentary, but it's a way, in a way, people can say, well, this is an impressive tradition. It's happened for 1,000 years, right? There's been someone on the throne of England, and they've used some of the same symbolism and liturgy and process, right? So in some ways, wow, that's remarkable. In other ways, it's preserving iniquity because very few people have any clue what's going on. So it's this kind of very exclusive social club of people who actually understand why we're doing this. And when we pick it apart, the why of why you're doing this might not be a why that many of us connect with, right? So generally, I'm a fan of how do we open up the political process, even things like calling people the right honorable gentleman from Peckham and the very reverend, I don't know if that's what we need in the 21st century if we're going to care about opening up the political process to people, or it needs to be so mainstreamed in curriculum that everyone would know what that language is and why that language is used. And I get that if you use rarefied language, it creates a sort of, hopefully, a culture of dignity and importance, perhaps. Although, as I say that, I'm not sure that people necessarily are speaking to each other with dignity and reverence. But I think we need to open these things up. So being part of a group where people are talking to one another peer to peer, who haven't been involved in the political process, and then saying and hearing them say, it doesn't matter to me whether the council does what we're talking about here today. What matters to me is that we're being heard by government. And when have we had that experience before? Most of us have not had the experience of government really listening to us. You might have had some kind of survey, maybe. You might have a great member of parliament or congressperson who's regularly in your community, and you go and you do feel heard by them. And that's amazing, obviously, if that's your experience. But for most people, they haven't had the experience of feeling heard. And so part of what I'm imagining is that we need to start hearing each other more and taking more responsibility for the decisions that happen in our community. That governance needs to be more distributed. It doesn't just happen on a hill in a fancy room where we use fancy names. It needs to happen with ordinary people in their community in a way that they can have their voices heard. Again, how do we get there from here? That's an interesting question. Lots of unanswered questions, but that sort of basic premise that you being excluded from the political process outside of voting, which is a fairly weak civic act in my view. Obviously, people died and fought for it, and I totally appreciate that, and it's a lot better than feudalism and monarchy, and we need to appreciate that. But one of the ways that you appreciate the people who went before you and sacrificed for things that you now have that you don't have to think so hard about, and obviously some people do have to think harder about them because voter suppression is real, but you get the point I'm angling at. One of the ways that you honor people who fought and died for things that you now have is that you go further and you push harder, right? It's not that you just sit there sort of grateful and smug and content. It's that you actually say, wow, now that we have that ability that we didn't have, how can we make this more just, right? How can we, as Martin Luther King was talking about, how can we follow that arc of justice if the moral arc of the universe does indeed bend towards justice, and we can debate that, but how do we bring more of that forward? how could we create something so that your grandchildren think it's normal, that it doesn't matter what background they're from, that they're going to be in the political process, right? Rather than looking at a Congress and Parliament and thinking, well, who from my background, right? If I come from a really working class background, how many working class people are really in Congress? It's very few. It's really hard, because a big way that you get connected and elected in Congress is you have to raise money. And generally speaking, if you're from a working class background, a lot of the people you're going to know aren't going to have the same resources as people that are part of the donor class, right? So what about designing for a system where that wouldn't matter? And you might think, well, why am I talking to you about this? Because you're not a political hack. You're not in the consultant class. You don't spend your time in Westminster or DC or pick your center of political power. It's because my sense is that the future of politics ultimately is going to be more written by all of us than we actually currently believe. The people of Iceland rewrote their charter through a massive consultation process where everyone was invited to be part of it. Now, Iceland is a small country by most developed nations, or even just any nation standard. I think it's like 300,000 people. So it's really the size of a small to medium-sized city in most of the West. But if they can do it, I'm sure a lot of us can figure it out. And if you're going to live by a set of rules, should you live by a set of rules that were created by people 9 generations ago? Maybe if they're really good, but why not test and find out? Are they still the rules that make sense today? You can go to the Jefferson Memorial here in DC, and there's a quote emblazoned there where Jefferson is saying that, as rules progress, so should laws, that laws shouldn't be static. And obviously we have legislatures in part so that laws aren't static, and they do in some ways evolve. Might not be in the direction that you like always, but they do evolve through time. But the ultimate rule is the rules that govern the rules, right? That's the Constitution. And the Constitution is sacred. And I get why that's the case, because it's the founding document here in America that set the whole thing in motion. And it's an inspiring document, and it was ahead of its time. And it was I think an act of political genius. It's not to say it got everything exactly perfect, but all documents are compromise. I think it was pretty far-sighted and amazing. But I also think that we honor Jefferson and the people that wrote it by asking the question, is it fit for purpose now in a world of social media and AI and mass education, which would have been very hard to predict that it would go in that direction. Maybe we need to up our game and get more involved and take ownership of that document and take ownership of hitting refresh and thinking about what would be a fair structure, given there are so many disparate views in society. Rather than it just being, how can my group with my values win out? How can we create a sort of multi-win document with compromise, or some kind of process of renewal that gets embedded into the system, so that periodically we are renewing these things to check, hey, is this the best of how we now think about humans and human nature and the nature of our endeavors together? Are we including some of our hard-fought wins? For instance, there's an equal rights amendment that's been around since the 70s. I was actually last year watching a demonstration, a group of courageous young women who were trying to shut down a street to say, hey, why can't we get an equal rights amendment? And on its face, it seems like a very obvious ask, but it's really difficult to get amendments. We haven't had a substantive amendment in the US since the 1970s. And if you're writing a document today, you'd probably bake that in, wouldn't you? Wouldn't it be fair to say all people are equal, and just to get that in there? So some things might be easier to be, baked in and in the consciousness of the preamble, or whatever is in the same way that the Declaration of Independence is the animating document that the Constitution kind of sits on top of. Maybe there's an animating preamble today that has a different set of presuppositions that are more fit for purpose for our time. Or at least let's ask that question. And I'm curious if you were invited to be part of that kind of process. And maybe it's not national. Maybe it's just in your locale. Maybe it's your city. Maybe it's your town where you live. And they say, hey, what about we update the city charter and we get a demographically representative group of citizens in the room? And we find some way to invite all people into the conversation. Maybe that's an online consultation process. Maybe there's some direct voting. Maybe there's a series of open meetings that anyone can participate in. Maybe eventually it goes to a referendum where everyone gets to say yes or no. Do we want to adopt this new constitution or not? Would you get involved? What would have to be true for you to care about that? What would have to be true for you to think that you were qualified, that your experience mattered, right? And we can find constitutional lawyers to express in clean legal language what ordinary people want and think doesn't mean that we all need to be constitutional experts. But you are probably an expert in what kind of values you want embedded as the sort of founding principles of your society, or you might even, through a deliberative process, become clear what kind of political system you want, and whether what we call democracy, which is really, republicanism, right? It's a representative system. I remember actually being at my favorite lecturers at university was a guy, David Runciman, who a lot of people know now actually because he's become a sort of medium-sized podcaster over the last decade. And he said representative democracy is much more about representation than it is about democracy. And I remember hearing that and being like, oh, wow, I mean, he might be wrong, but no one's ever even mentioned that. It always surprised me, these sort of moments of something that seemed such like a fundamental question to me. And also the limits of my thinking, I'd never thought of it. But it's almost like, shouldn't that have been shouldn't that have been an A-level politics? Shouldn't have we all been thinking about that? And if that's true, that it is more about representation, and some of the history of representative democracy in Europe, to my understanding, is about appeasing the aristocracy, the barons, the people that wanted more political power. And it's about a sort of a settlement between kings and an elite to say, well, you get some kind of voice, and therefore we can continue to tax you and fight these wars that we need to fight. That it's actually, the history of it isn't about how do we from scratch create the fairest system. So I think sometimes we sort of think of representative democracy as if the sort of people that enacted that were really kind of thinking about us and how we have voice and agency and political empowerment, and how do we create the fairest system. Obviously most systems evolve incrementally, or maybe there's revolution at some point. But actually, representative democracy, I think, was really a sort of a bargain that was struck to keep the then existing monarchical structures in place. And then through time, actually, the balance of power between those few people that got representation and the monarch started to shift, right? And eventually the representatives, the ministers, the aides get more political power, and we eventually end up with a parliamentary system. But it's not like it was designed from scratch like that. Now, some people would say that's the strength of it. It wasn't designed out of someone's mind. It was hard fought, lived experience, one incremental change. I'm just inviting us to get clear about what has happened, because I think it informs your view of what is now happening, and why maybe we don't have a more full promise of democracy. If democracy means power to the people, if democracy means the people rule, the rule of the demos. And the other thing that's a little bit inconvenient that doesn't get talked about enough possibly is, who are the demos now? Right? If you spend 3 hours a day, which is the average for someone in the West that spends on social media, I mean, most of those social media companies come out of California, gross generalization, but most of them come out of America. TikTok's obviously kind of based out of Singapore, kind of Chinese. So what law should govern that? Should you be governed by Beijing law that's written in a language that you probably don't understand? Maybe it's just the English version of that. Should you be governed by the law of California when you're using YouTube, Facebook, etc.? Maybe the technology that's so inherently global and whose usership is so inherently global needs to have some kind of enforceable global law. And maybe we're ready for some enforceable global law, but to get enforceable global law, you really need to talk about global sovereignty, to say some things are inherently global, and there is a kind of sovereignty that isn't just when your country begrudgingly says, okay, mate, we'll agree to this global compact, but by the way, you can't bind us in, we'll monitor it ourselves. I'm thinking of climate change. And if we don't hit our targets, there's no repercussions, right? That's not law, right? That's please, that's it would be nice if, that's do your best. And there's a place for those things in life. I just think we should be open and sober about the language. So when people talk about international law, they forget that there isn't really, what they really mean, I think, is enforceable global law. But what they actually talking about is international law, which is kind of advisory opinions from the United Nations, right? And there are some things that, are treaties between countries that if people break, that there are repercussions, and there are some court systems that deal with that, international trade courts, international court of justice in some ways. But we don't really have an inherently global system, right? And maybe that's not right. Maybe that's actually it's too fragile, and we don't have enough issues that are inherently global. But if that's the case, let's just talk that way, and then we don't need to be disappointed. At the moment, we talk about international law, and then people aren't aren't abiding by international law, well, there's no mechanism that makes them abide by it. If all law was advisory, would you always pay your taxes on time? Would you always build your house to code? Most people need some kind of enforcement mechanism to say, why should I do it if other people aren't going to do it? And that's sort of where international law is, right? Why should I do it if other people aren't going to do it? Well, at some point, we might have to reimagine that the demos or the demoi there's actually more than one demos, right? And maybe you're a demos in your town, and maybe you're a demos in your country, and maybe there is such a thing as a world demos, and all of those things need the right kind of sovereignty attached to them, and they all need an ability to be expressed in the right kind of ways. The challenge is they're not going to agree, and we don't really have a system that pauses for that. And generally, we have a nation-centric supremacy. So when the chips are down, nation states do what they want to do. And you've seen this. Whatever you think of what's going on in the Middle East, no one's under any illusions that Israel is being particularly contained by other countries in what it's going to do or not going to do. You might imagine eventually a system where there are global enforcement mechanisms, but we haven't created that yet. But maybe at some point, through participatory mechanisms and citizens' assemblies, we are actually going to have to create that. And we're going to have to go further than the United Nations, right? We need to stop criticizing the United Nations for doing things that it was never really designed, empowered, or funded to do, and have a serious conversation about, if you're going to run the world, you actually need more than 80 billion a year to do that, because that budget is so much smaller than, it's smaller than some states in the US, let alone the country, let alone 190 countries. So I'm telling you this. Why? Because yes, we're in some times of decay and breakdown, but it seems to me, and this is just my intuition, it could be my hallucination, I'm not saying I'm right about this, but it does really seem to me that on the other side of that breakdown are going to be some buildups. There's going to be some new structures, and it's going to take a lot of us to do that lifting. Otherwise we could regress and kind of go back to not just the current structures, but the older structures, right? It's possible that we could go to a world of more authoritarianism, dictatorship, monarchy, but that's not the future that I want. It's not the future that you want. And actually the future that we could build together might be better. And I don't say that as, sort of head in the sand, pie in the sky, kind of fantasy. I say that ideally with some sobriety, right? That actually the history of more distribution of power is that people have to claim it. Right. So for you to have a system where you're more empowered in, it's not going to be handed to you. You'd have to claim it. You'd have to roll your sleeves up and want to get involved. You'd have to want to get involved in rewriting the charter in your town. You'd have to accept that invitation to be on the Citizens' Assembly. You'd have to be in some conversations that say, actually, who is the demos in a highly globalized world where the fate seems increasingly intertwined? Who is the demos now? Is it the same as it was 300 years ago? Maybe not. If we're all living by the Treaty of Westphalia from the 1700s, does that make sense anymore? What even is in that treaty? I don't know. I've not read it, but it seems that sort of basic idea that this is a country, and inside of the country it's your business, and other countries don't really get to say what you want to do internally. That sort of way of thinking about sovereignty, maybe it was good then, but maybe in today's world where huge numbers of people are using the same technologies, where so many issues seem to be at least partly global in nature, maybe it's not fit for purpose. But the current system won't do that, right? It's going to need an innovation from us. And part of that, I think, is an internal stance. And that's where it kind of goes back into the personal growth background that perhaps you and I share more of, is that for you to be more empowered, you have to claim something. You have to claim something of your political agency, and not just act like a disempowered person, even though I get that in the current system. Most of us are very disempowered, perhaps a periodic vote notwithstanding. But to actually start to be in conversation with people about, hey, how could we take more ownership and more responsibility? And is there some kind of political maturity that was wanting to happen in me? I mean, that's what I feel like over the last few years, life has been offering me. I think I've got a ways to go, but to say, hey, you've been a bit checked out from politics, and maybe your participation is more required. Like maybe you actually need to show up to many more events. Maybe you need to do some more lifting on some of these issues. Maybe you need to build some bridges with people that have different political views. Maybe you need to befriend people that have different political views, and sometimes be in this gnarly places that's going to take you. That's work that any one of us can do. You don't need anyone else to sanction you to do that work. And if most people can find 3 hours a day to be on social media, then they can find time to go be part of a citizens assembly. And most people enjoy it. It actually gets them civically activated, right? And you might say, well, I need to be invited to do that. Well, yeah, cool. If the invitation comes, say yes. But also communities are activating around this, where a few people are getting together and saying, hey, this affordability thing is an issue, or no one can afford childcare. Let's have an assembly. Let's talk about it. That's the sort of it's the energy of it, right? And we're in the early days, and we'll get better at it, and we'll refine how we do it, and we'll get best practice, and all that stuff can come. But there's sort of a basic identity shift that says, you're no longer really a subject that just lets the political class or the monarch or whoever it is kind of get out there and do their thing. That actually, if citizenship means something, if your political identity means something, that maybe you can activate and take more responsibility for the decisions that are made in your country. We very easily use the language of innocent civilians, right? And I get what that means, and I get that really bad things happen to people who didn't directly participate in why they're happening to them, right? They're suffering kind of on behalf of a collective which someone's trying to punish. In other ways, we're not innocent civilians, right? If we are 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 80 years old, and our countries are doing things that we don't agree with, we're part of that. And our tax money funds it. And you might not have all the levers of powers to completely stop it, but you can step into an agency that says, hey, actually, if these things are done in my name with my money, maybe I need to be having a voice about this, or maybe I need to follow the money trail, or I need to care about this. It's a subtle shift, but it's kind of like, rather than politics happening over there on the Hill in the Congress or in the Houses of Parliament or whatever it is in your country, it's that actually we could distribute that decision making more, and that you're involved. You are co-producing and co-governing and co-responsible and co-creative for what is happening in your politics. You see, it's a different stance. I don't know exactly what that looks like, but that's at a high level, that's the sort of shift that maybe we're being invited into. I could be wrong. I'm curious of your perspective. I'm not saying I'm right, but that actually you might get better decisions when more of us are involved, not fewer of us. And you might get a more rounded truth in politics if it's not just the perspectives of the sort of typical elite ruling class career politicians, but actually if ordinary people are much more involved in the political process. And through it, they become the educated citizenry, which other people will say, well, the reason why I don't want ordinary people involved in political process is because ordinary people don't know enough. Ordinary people are dumb. And to some extent, we are dumb, right? When we're on the outside of the political process. The insiders know a lot more about what's going on. But the way to have people be less dumb and to be more educated, I don't think it's only to leave that to schools and colleges. It's to design for political processes that educate people through the very participation. To say, hey, if you're going to come and spend 9 days studying and learning together, hearing from experts, asking them questions, deliberating with one another, hearing, being impacted, and coming to some consensus policy positions, that is education. And after 9 days, that person is going to know a lot more than the median voter in the country. And frankly, they're probably going to know more than the politicians that normally vote on this stuff. I mean, I've tuned into like the Senate Foreign Relations Committee talking about sex trafficking, and the person, high ranking on that committee at the time, being like, the level of questions that they're asking, unless they're dumbing this down for some reason that I don't understand, these aren't very penetrating questions. It doesn't seem to me that they have a huge mastery of these issues. So I would take an ordinary person without a vested interest, without a donor class behind them, without lobbyists around them, being in the room for 9 days, being open to their peers and having to talk about this stuff. I would take that over a bought and paid for politician. And I don't mean anything bad to any politician, just that's how the system works. And certainly in the US, we know that, right? So we're just looking for better. We're not looking for best. If you've gotten this far, thank you for hearing me. Thanks for listening. Thanks for being with me. Please leave me a comment. I get to them all, whether you're watching on Facebook or YouTube or wherever you're picking this up. Thanks for being here. I'm curious if what I'm saying is making sense, if it's giving you more hope. That's the idea of this. It's not false hope that I'm wanting. I'm trying to push back a lot against what I see as false hope, which is sort of like, hey, elect me to Congress and we can change the system. Most of that stuff falls flat. I mean, even Barack Obama couldn't really do most of that, and he got the top job. I'm talking about true hope, which notices that there is some kind of evolution that happens through time, and it's not always linear. It's typically non-linear, and sometimes it's one step forward and two steps back. But there is the possibility of making things better, but our participation is required and our sobriety is required. I'm not talking about fantasies and pies in the sky. I'm talking about a vision co-created together of how things could be better, and being willing to assume the identity and the responsibility that allows us to step into that, to basically say, if you want a different country and you want a different world, your participation is required. And it might need a little bit of hard work, but it will be worth it for what you can create, not just for yourself, but ultimately for all generations to come. That's what we're talking about, really. That's what's at stake. So thanks for being here. Hang in there if you're having a difficult time. I know that these are discombobulating times, and I know that suffering can be real, and I've felt some of that. So it's none of this is to suggest that these are easy times. I don't think they are. I think there's a lot at stake, and that's changing, and a lot that's also being attacked and maybe put into decay. And maybe some of that stuff is good stuff we need to fight harder to keep, but maybe some of it is also pointing to systemic weaknesses that actually need to be addressed in order to create the energy to create something better. So that's my hope. And as always, I'm Jack. Thanks for being here.